In the last week of his life, Jesus warned his disciples concerning trials that were to come upon them and upon the world. He exhorts the listener, do not be alarmed. A reading from Mark chapter 13. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. The year might be 2100, about 85 years from now. You drive north and turn west on U.S. Highway 6. But now the road is just potholes connected by pavement fragments. On your left is an old statue of a deer that looks to be about 100 years old. As you glance over prairie grass, tall weeds all around, clumps of trees obscure the view. To the north of the deer, on your right, is a pile of rubble, shattered bricks. A little further on is a gaping hole in the ground. In the center of the hole is more rubble, more bricks. The structure once built over this hole has been gone for many years. So little of this building is left that it's impossible to tell exactly what stood here. So what are your feelings when you hear me describe one possible future for Salem Church? Shock? Anger? Sadness? Disbelief? I bet if a prophet stood outside this church and prophesied just what I said, you'd have the sheriff ride him out of town, or you do it yourselves. After all, a Salem church of some sort has stood on this spot for over 100 years. The thought of this plot of land without the church is scary, for not even your oldest members here can remember a time before the church stood here. Imagine then, for a moment, what it must have felt, how the disciples must have felt when Jesus described the destruction of the temple. The highest point in Jerusalem had been a temple not for 100 years, like Salem Church, but for 1,000 years. The temple itself was a center of religious life, center of all life, not just for half a county, like our church. It was the religious center for the whole nation. The temple was grand, beautiful, magnificent structure. The historian Josephus writes that many of its stones were huge, nearly 40 feet in length, 18 feet wide, 12 feet thick. We might have trouble building with such a massive stone in this day using modern machinery. They used ramps, levers, teams of horses, and human willpower to lay stone after stone. It was backbreaking work for many people for decades to make progress in its construction. So, of course, it was almost impossible for the disciples to listen and to imagine a time when somebody could and would go to the trouble to tear it all down. Torn apart, ruined. For Jesus to talk about their beloved temple like that was blasphemy. What he said was so horrible, the disciples didn't dare ask Jesus in public for details. Instead, they waited until they were alone with him to find out more. The private conversation the disciples had with Jesus was probably longer than what Mark records in his gospel today. Why did Jesus say what he said about the temple? How could he say something so cruel to the disciples? Well, first and foremost, Jesus said it because it was the truth. He saw the handwriting on the wall. The Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, less than 40 years after Jesus entered Jerusalem for the last time. Jesus talked about the temple to confront the religious establishment, to confront corrupt leadership that allowed the temple to become more than a center of worship. Instead, it had become a well-oiled machine of thievery. If Jesus wanted to stir people up, he could hardly have said anything that angered them more. After all, the temple was at the heart and soul of the Jewish religion. It's no wonder that Jesus was crucified just a few days after he spoke in public of the temple's destruction. But on a deeper level, Jesus wanted to think a little bit more. He wanted his disciples to think about what he'd been saying all along, what he'd been saying about the future. The kingdom of heaven was coming, and a new religion was coming with it. The Jewish temple religion, and even its massive buildings, would be swept away. The cataclysmic change to come would not be an easy for that people. Would not be an easy change for that people of God. With his talk of the future, then, Jesus probably scared his disciples silly. He probably scared anyone else who heard him talk about broken temple, an earthquake, and famine. No doubt there were spies around who would report to the Jewish leaders anything Jesus said. No doubt Jesus shook all those leaders up and infuriated them too much to stay alive. But only by being shaken up could people begin to understand what Jesus was truly saying. The old Jewish temple religion would be swept away. The religious leaders that were so high and mighty in Jesus' day would fall, and other leaders would take their place. And what about us? Does Jesus want us to be comfortable as we wait for our end to come, whenever that end would be? Yes and no. If being comfortable means being content with the world as it is, Jesus does not want us to be comfortable. But Jesus also wants us to be at peace. The way to peace is to have a relationship with Him, not the world and not a building. If we are too attached to a building or anything else, it's a mistake. But if our faith is in the person of Jesus Christ, we need not worry. We don't need to matter. It doesn't matter to us what happens, no matter what the times may bring. The tragedy which unfolded this week in France was unsettling and honestly more than a bit frightening. But even so, we need not fear in the long run. I can imagine a world 40 years from now with our USA bankrupt and broken apart. Can you? I can imagine a sad country where the values we see portrayed in TV and soap operas are truly everywhere, and no one even tries to be good. Can you? I can imagine famines coming with too many people and too little food, while our weather goes haywire. Can you? Do I really believe the world will go that way? I'm not really sure. Do I honestly believe that Salem Church will be destroyed in just a few short decades? No. It could happen, but probably not. A church community that started in the woods, endured for a depression and 2 world wars, will likely be here for a while yet. And in the end, it really doesn't matter what happened to the temple and what will happen to Salem Church. The temple was the heart of Jewish religion and faith, but it was not Jewish faith itself. Salem Church is close to your heart, the heart of your faith, but your faith in God will survive its destruction, whenever that might be. This building is finite, bound in God's time. God's time will turn any stone, any building, to dust. But if we believe what Christ tells us, we people here today are not bound by that same time. We Christians are eternal. At the end of all time, God's kingdom will come in power. Because of what Christ did and still does for us, we will be there to see the end of everything. And that new heavenly kingdom will be far different than this world. Pain and suffering and injustice, like they experienced in France this week, will be gone. Even the way we worship will be different. Revelation 21 says that in God's kingdom there will be no church or temple, because in God's kingdom, the temple is God Almighty. In heaven, there will be nothing to distract us from God. Our joy will have no bounds, no beginning and no end. Thank God, thank Jesus Christ for taking us up so that we pay attention. But thank Jesus even more, that in the end, Jesus will bring us safely home at last. It will be so. Amen.